just quickly want to point one practical thing out. These guidelines are applicable to containers that are being exported from South Africa. So if you're importing containers, you have to worry about your suppliers, whether they've managed to get the container on board at the port of loading. All right. As has been said by Kirsty and previous speakers, there's nothing new to a shipper having to declare the mass of his cargo. This is required in terms of the Hague-Visby rules and our local regulations as of 2004. What is new is that one of the methods for weighing, method 2, is now required to be certified by the authority. The authority is Samsung. That's important. Secondly, and this is the most important, under Solas, a carrier, a ship owner, cannot load that container on board his vessel. Now, that's important because if the ship owner wants to maintain his insurances for his vessel, his hull insurance, P&I cover, he must comply with this guideline. It's no longer a practical decision. These guidelines are mandatory. That's very important because the enforcement of these guidelines is not dependent really on, for example, the Department of Transport deciding whether or not to enforce it. The enforcement is more practical. When your container arrives at the port, the ship owner is going to say to the master, do not load that container. That's going to cause a major problem for the cargo interest. In turn, the cargo interest insurance. Your institute cargo clauses do not cover delay. So if you've got perishable goods that's been containerized, goes down to Durban, it's not allowed into the vessel, and that cargo is damaged due to that delay, your general marine insurance cargo won't cover it. So compliance with these regulations are going to have to, it's going to have to be done, and it's going to have to be done by the deadline, 1st of July. And this situation is very different, for example, from the amendments to the regulations published under the National Road Traffic Act, which came out last year. And there was a whole lot of discussion about how those regulations would be implemented if they can be. But as far as I'm aware, the Department of Transport, who is responsible for enforcing those regulations, hasn't done so. So people don't really worry about them practically on the ground. The guidelines are very different. People are going to worry about them. Okay. The guidelines form part of South African law. It comes through Solas, which automatically in amendments to Solas, which is the International Convention, comes under the Merchant Shipping Act. So there's no question of whether or not they're going to be binding on South Africa. They are. There's been some talk in the media recently about the Americans delaying the implementation of the guidelines for 1 year. Under the Solas Convention, the Americans can do that if they notify the IMO within time, before the deadline of 1st of July. Practically speaking, that's only going to apply to American flagged vessels and American ports. The implementation of these guidelines are going to come through the flag state. Each vessel is registered in terms of under a flag. If that flag state says to its ship owners, you need to comply with these guidelines in order to be Solas compliant, the foreign ship owner is going to go to American port and he's going to still say to the cargo interest, look, you have to comply with the guidelines. I want to verify gross mass, despite what the local American authority says. One of the reasons why I think these guidelines have been or caused such confusion in the industry is because how they've come about. The IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, is a part of the UN, but traditionally speaking, it thinks of ships on the sea. It's a ship-owning interest entity. It's concerned about ship safety. And as the previous speaker mentioned, this is the first time that it's digressed to some extent and thought, well, let's go inland, let's start regulating the cargo interests. In doing so, I don't think the IMO has engaged with your cargo interests, with your shipper interests practically. And the problem is that the IMO appears to have misunderstood the whole logistics, inland logistics process, as well as the manufacturing process. And that's why method 2, I think, is causing a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, within the industries, because the IMO has failed to understand that. And also in terms of the guidelines, the appointed authority is SAMHSA. Now SAMHSA has got a wide mandate in terms of the local legislation, but essentially it's an institution that thinks of safety of ships at sea, oil spills, crew matters, port state control issues. It's not really an organization that is well suited at this stage to think of the manufacturing process inland. How is a factory in Johannesburg who's manufacturing television sets going to contend with method 2? So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of difficulty in the industry. Let me just see if I've covered everything. In understanding these guidelines, everyone can go to SAMHSA's website, download them, they're on the marine notices. One will readily understand that the guidelines are drafted in fairly plain, simple language, and that the industry needs guidance more from the role players, for example, Transnet, and more importantly, SAMHSA. The industry needs to know, how is SAMHSA going to implement these guidelines, in particular method 2. For example, there's an exception to method 2, and that exception is if the shipper is dealing with an individual originally sealed package with an accurate mass of the package and cargo items that are clearly and permanently marked on their surface, then they do not need to comply with method 2. Now, when I read that, I'm sitting at my desk, I'm like, well, does the initial weighing, the initial process in terms of which the accurate weight is obtained, does that have to be done in terms of a certified process or not? And in order for SAMHSA to really answer that question, they need to understand the manufacturing process. And I think that's a fundamental difficulty that we have here. The cargo interests have not been consulted properly, but unfortunately for them, they have to comply with these guidelines. And there's very valid reasons. Ship safety is a concern for all, and in theory, shippers have had to comply with at least providing a gross mass, not a verified gross mass, to the shipping lines for some time. Another soft target in the shipping interest community is Transnet. Some cargo interests seem to think that Transnet should weigh the containers. It's providing port services, they should. I've looked at the guidelines, and in my view, Transnet has no legal obligation whatsoever to weigh these containers. The guidelines place the obligation squarely on the shoulders of the cargo interest, the shipper, and that must be appreciated. Perhaps one day Transnet could reconsider that position when the port facilities are up and running to cater for that, and particularly in view of the fact that South African ports are notoriously expensive to ship cargo from. But anyway, as it stands now, Transnet is under no legal obligation, in my view. Just want to double check. Yes, I think I've covered everything. This is really something that you, as a cargo interest, for those of you and freight forwarders, need to understand. You need to appreciate how your insurances work on that cargo. You can understand practically that the carriers are going to enforce this, most likely. In reading the guidelines, for example, one of the requirements is that the shipper must give advance notice. That is a vague term, but one that I think practitioners, people in practice, can solve through proper communication through all the right channels. Essentially, the carrier needs this information, the verified gross mass, in order to make up its stowage plan. Obviously, it cannot only receive that information when the container is in the port. It needs it beforehand. So I think those practical issues can actually be sorted out through proper communication. Just one last point before I forget. The definition of a shipper in the guidelines is fairly broad. Freight forwarders, I've forewarned the insurers that if the freight forwarder is the one signing the bill of lading or giving the final instruction, it is a shipper for the purposes of these guidelines. There's a lot of practical implication, because if you're the shipper, you bear the obligation to comply, to give the verified gross mass, and you need to ensure that you're in a position to do so as a freight forwarder.